Chicago, it happened again last night. Kids shooting kids.
The year is 2005, Chicago's South Side. There is a man walking through Ada Park, and when I say walking, I don't mean strolling. I mean moving the way kings move, with purpose, with weight. Every person on that block knows his name. Every dealer on that strip has eaten off his table at some point. Every rival in the city has thought twice before crossing into his territory. His name is Walter Bennett. But the streets don't call him Walter. The streets call him Silk. And on this particular day in 2005, the last full day of his life, Silk woke up like a man who had survived everything the city of Chicago had ever thrown at him. He had beaten cases, he had buried enemies, he had watched friends fall and kept moving. He was 30 years old, he was untouchable, and at least that's what he believed. Because somewhere across that same city, a plan had already been set in motion. A plan that Silk never saw coming. Not because he wasn't careful, but because the person who set it up was someone he trusted completely. Someone he had broken bread with. Someone he had looked out for. Someone whose name he would never have put on a list of threats because in his mind, that person wasn't a threat. That person was family. By the time the sun went down that night, Walter Silk Bennett would be dead, shot by a sniper, taken out the way only the most dangerous men in Chicago are ever taken out, because nobody could walk up to him face to face. This is the story of Silk from Ada Park, King Von's father. A man so respected, so feared, and so deeply embedded in the streets of Chicago's South Side that his son would spend his entire rap career trying to live up to his name. A man whose life reads like a warning that the streets never stop collecting their debts, no matter how careful you are, no matter how tight your circle, no matter how long you've managed to survive. This is the story of his final 48 hours and everything that led up to them. Stay with me, because this one goes deep. To understand who Walter Silk Bennett was, you have to start at the beginning. Not at the moment of his death, not at the height of his power. You have to start where every story like this starts, in the neighborhood that built him, on the blocks that shaped him, in the specific circumstances that turned a boy named Walter into a man the streets called Silk. Ada Park, Chicago's South Side. If you've never been there, let me paint the picture for you. Ada Park sits in the Roseland and Inglewood corridor of Chicago's South Side, one of the most historically complex and deeply misunderstood parts of any major American city. These are not the neighborhoods you see in the tourism brochures. These are the neighborhoods where the gap between the Chicago that gets celebrated and the Chicago that gets ignored is most visible. Brick two-flats with peeling paint and iron security doors. Narrow lots where grass gave up years ago and gravel took over. Corner stores sealed behind bulletproof plexiglass because the people running them learned early that trust is a luxury you can't always afford. But here's the thing about places like Ada Park that outsiders consistently get wrong. The assumption is that these are just places of destruction, environments that take from people rather than give. And while the violence is real, and while the poverty is real, and while the limited opportunity is absolutely real, these blocks also produce extraordinary people. They produce loyalty, they produce toughness. They produce a kind of creativity born from necessity that you simply cannot manufacture in more comfortable environments. The South Side of Chicago has given the world some of its most important music: blues, soul, gospel, house, drill. It has produced politicians, athletes, artists, and thinkers who changed the country. It has also tragically buried generations of young men and women who had everything it took to change the world but never got the chance. Walter Eugene Bennett was born into this world on October 28, 1974. He came into a Chicago that was already in the middle of a seismic shift in its street politics. The early 1970s had seen the Black Gangster Disciples operating as one of the most powerful street organizations in the city, a sprawling network of blocks and leadership that had grown up partly in the shadow of Fred Hampton and the Black Panthers, partly out of the raw economic desperation of neighborhoods like Inglewood and Roseland that the city had systematically underfunded and neglected for decades. By the time Walter was old enough to understand the world around him, that organization had already begun to splinter. The Gangster Disciples, the Black Disciples, and the remnants of other factions were carving up the South Side into competing territories. Alliances shifted, leadership changed, and the streets of neighborhoods like Ada Park became the proving grounds where young men established their loyalty, their toughness, and their standing in a world that offered very few other paths to power or respect. Walter grew up watching all of this. He grew up in a household shaped by the same pressures that shaped every household on his block. Limited income, limited opportunity, and the constant background noise of a neighborhood that had been told for decades by the broader city that it didn't really matter. His childhood was not unique in that sense. It was the shared experience of an entire generation of South Side kids who were handed a world they didn't design and told to figure it out. What was unique about Walter was what he did with that world. Because from an early age, people who knew him noticed something different about him. He was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, not passive. He observed before he acted. He listened more than he talked. In a neighborhood where volume and aggression were often the first language of young men trying to establish themselves, Walter Bennett communicated differently. He communicated with presence, with stillness, with a quality that people around him struggled to articulate but immediately recognized. That quality would eventually earn him his name, Silk, not because he was delicate, not because he was soft, but because everything about him was smooth, composed, finished, like fabric that had no rough edges, no loose threads, no place where you could get a grip and pull. He dressed clean in a neighborhood where clean clothes were a statement of pride and self-respect. He spoke carefully in conversations where other men rushed to fill silence. He moved through Ada Park like someone who had already thought about every room he was going to walk into before he walked into it. By the time he was in his mid-teens, Walter Bennett had aligned himself with the Black Disciples, the faction that had emerged from the gangster disciples split and claimed significant territory across Chicago's South Side, including Ada Park. This wasn't just a decision about gang affiliation. In the world he inhabited, it was a decision about identity, about protection, about which set of relationships and obligations would define his daily life. In neighborhoods like Ada Park in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the choice wasn't always between gangs or no gangs. Sometimes it was about which community you were going to be part of, which people were going to be your people. And Silk was very deliberate about his people. Here's where his reputation really begins to take shape. Because it's one thing to join a street organization. Plenty of young men did that. What separated Silk, what made him different, what made his name carry the specific weight that it eventually carried, was how he rose within that world. Silk did not rise through chaos. He did not rise through reckless violence or the kind of loud, performative aggression that gets young men noticed but also gets them locked up or killed before they reach 25. He rose through something more valuable and more rare in the streets. Consistency, reliability, the ability to be exactly who he said he was, every single day, in every single interaction. People close to Silk from those years describe a man who understood the street economy at a level that most of his peers didn't. He understood that money was power, but that money without discipline was temporary. He understood that respect was the real currency. That if people feared you but didn't respect you, you were always one bad decision away from losing everything. And he understood, perhaps most importantly, that the size of your circle was less important than the quality of it. He became known in Ada Park and the surrounding neighborhoods as someone whose word meant something. If Silk told you he was going to do something, it got done. If Silk told you he had your back, you could sleep on it. And if Silk told you there would be consequences for crossing him, those consequences arrived. Not loudly, not dramatically, but they arrived. By his early 20s, Silk had built something that very few people in his position managed to build. Genuine, lasting power. Not the temporary kind that comes from being the most volatile person on the block. The kind that comes from years of consistent behavior, sound judgment, and a track record that spoke for itself. He was one of the most significant figures in Ada Park. He was one of the most feared and respected names in that part of Chicago's street world. And he had accumulated real wealth, not the kind of wealth that gets displayed recklessly, not the chains and cars that attract attention and invite robbery. Calculated wealth, the kind built quietly, invested carefully, protected by the same discipline that protected everything else in his life. People who knew him from that era describe him as the richest person on Ada Park. Not a boast, just a fact that everyone in that world understood. All of this while he was still in his 20s. All of this while most of his peers were either behind bars, underground, or struggling to hold on to whatever small piece of the street economy they had managed to claim. Silk had built something extraordinary, and he had done it entirely on his own terms, which makes what happened next, and why it happened, all the more devastating to understand. Let's talk about the other side of Silk's life, the side that doesn't get discussed as much when people tell his story, but the side that ultimately matters more than any of the rest of it, the side where he was a father. Sometime in the early 1990s, Walter Silk Bennett came into the orbit of a young woman named Tasha. Tasha was navigating the South Side in the way that so many young women in those neighborhoods navigate it, with resilience, with hope, with the particular kind of strength that develops in people who don't have the luxury of falling apart. She was not a street figure. She was a woman trying to build a life in a place that didn't make building easy. Their relationship was complicated from the very beginning. Silk's life, the one he had built, the one that gave him power and wealth and respect, was also a life that made consistent partnership nearly impossible. He was consumed by the demands of the street world. He was in and out of legal trouble. He cycled through periods of incarceration that created long gaps in his presence. And the nature of his position meant that even when he was physically present, his attention and his focus were often somewhere else. Always watching, always calculating, always managing the invisible web of relationships and obligations that kept his world from collapsing. Tasha bore the weight of all of this. She fought to keep her family together through absences that were never fully explained and disruptions that were never fully resolved. She was, by every account, the anchor of her household, the one who showed up every day regardless of what was happening around her, regardless of whether Walter was there or not. On August 9th, 1994, she gave birth to a son. They named him Davon Daquan Bennett, and the world would eventually know him as King Von. In the early years of Davon's life, his father was largely absent. The prison stretches, the street demands, the complicated push and pull of a man who loved his children but had built a life that was fundamentally incompatible with being present for them. Davon grew up knowing his father's name, knowing his father's reputation, knowing that somewhere out there was this figure that the streets called Silk and that people spoke about with a particular kind of reverence, but he didn't know his father. Not in the way that matters, not in the way that shapes a child. That didn't happen until Davon was 8 years old. 8 years old. Think about that. For the first 8 years of his son's life, Walter Silk Bennett was essentially a story, a name, a reputation, a presence felt more through absence than through anything real. And then, when Davon was 8, something shifted. Whether it was a change in Silk's circumstances, a decision he made, a reckoning he arrived at, we don't know the exact mechanics of it. What we know is the result. Father and son finally met, really met, in a way that stuck. And in the 3 years that followed, just 3 years, from the time Davon was 8 until his father was killed when he was 11, Walter Silk Bennett managed to leave an impression on his son that never faded. Not in 3 years, not in 30, not ever. Von talked about his father in interviews with a reverence that was almost physically visible. You could see it in how he held himself when the subject came up. He described his father as the definition of real. He talked about the lessons Silk taught him. Not formal lessons, not sit-down conversations with moral conclusions, but the lessons that come from watching a man move through the world with a certain kind of integrity and intention. He learned from Silk about choosing your circle, about loyalty, about what it meant to be a man who other men respected not because they feared his violence, but because they trusted his word. He called his father Ada Park's finest. He called him the older version of himself. And in the song Exposing Me, he put it in words that millions of people would eventually hear. Rest in peace to Silk from Ada Park, that was the older me. That line is not a throwaway lyric. That line is a thesis statement. King Von was telling anyone who would listen that he understood himself to be a continuation of his father, not just genetically, not just in terms of physical resemblance, but in terms of code, in terms of philosophy, in terms of the way he moved through the world and the values he held above everything else. He was Silk's son in every way that mattered, and he knew it, and he carried it like a responsibility. Now we arrive at the part of this story that requires you to slow down and really sit with it, because this is where everything that came before, the rise, the power, the reputation, the family, the love, this is where all of it starts moving toward an end. It is 2005. Silk is 30 years old. 30 years old. By the standards of his world, by the brutal arithmetic of Chicago street life, where the actuarial tables for men in his position are grim and unforgiving, 30 is already extraordinary. Men in the street life of Chicago's South Side die young. They die in their teens, in their early 20s. The ones who make it to 30 have survived things that should have killed them multiple times. They have navigated close calls and betrayals and ambushes and cases and everything else the life throws at people who live in it long enough. Silk had navigated all of it. For more than a decade, he had moved through Ada Park and the broader South Side street world with the kind of awareness and discipline that kept him alive when others fell. He had built himself into something nearly untouchable, not because he was reckless with violence, but because he was so careful, so consistent, so disciplined about who he trusted and how he moved that getting to him was genuinely difficult. His enemies knew this. The people who had reason to want him gone. The rivals, the people who resented his power, the people who had been on the wrong end of his consequences, they knew that a direct approach wasn't going to work. You couldn't just walk up to Silk. He was too aware, too surrounded by people who were loyal to him, too strategic about his movements. If you wanted to get to Silk, you had to be creative, you had to be patient, and you had to have access. In the 48 hours before his death, by all accounts, Silk was moving normally. That word, normally, is the most haunting word in this entire story. Because normal for Silk looked like this. He woke up and went about his day with the quiet confidence of a man who had survived everything. He checked on his people. He handled his business. He moved through Ada Park the way he had moved through Ada Park for years, deliberately, calmly, with the awareness of his surroundings that had become second nature. There was no argument in the hours before his death that we know of. No public confrontation, no obvious sign that anything was wrong. He was not doing something reckless. He was not putting himself in an exposed position. He was, by all visible measures, operating exactly the way he always operated, carefully, deliberately, with his circle around him and his guard up. And that's the part that should send a chill down your spine, because the threat wasn't coming from outside that guard. It was already inside it. Sometime in the period leading up to his death, whether it was days before or weeks before, we don't know exactly, someone in Silk's circle had made a decision about their own survival versus his. A decision that, when you look at it through the cold logic of self-preservation, makes a certain terrible sense. Because being close to a man as powerful as Silk came with benefits, but it also came with risks. And at some point, someone calculated that those risks outweighed the loyalty they owed him. So they went to his enemies, and they offered the one thing his enemies had been unable to get on their own: access and information, patterns, routines, the specific details of where Silk would be and when and who would be around him. The kind of intelligence that you can only get from someone who is genuinely close, someone who has been in the rooms, eaten at the tables, moved through the same circles for long enough to know how everything works. With that information, a plan was built. And the plan was sophisticated in a way that tells you everything about how seriously Silk's enemies took him. Because they didn't plan a drive-by. They didn't plan a face-to-face confrontation. They planned something that required distance, positioning, and precision. A sniper. Let that settle for a moment. In Chicago street violence, in a world where most killings happen at close range, in the heat of conflict, in the chaotic seconds of a fight that escalates into something fatal, a sniper attack is categorically different. It requires planning. It requires resources. It requires someone to identify a location in advance, get into position, wait, and execute from a distance before the target has any opportunity to react. You don't deploy a sniper against someone you're not afraid of. You don't go through that level of planning and preparation for someone you think you can handle face to face. The decision to use a sniper is, in its own dark way, the highest possible acknowledgement of how dangerous Walter Silk Bennett was. His enemies were so afraid of him, so certain that any direct confrontation would go wrong for them, that the only option they saw was to take him out before he ever knew they were there. The location, according to community accounts, was outside a skating rink. A skating rink. Think about why that matters. This wasn't a trap laid in some abandoned lot in the middle of the night. This was a public place. A place with people around. A place associated with recreation, with normality, with the civilian world that exists alongside the street world but doesn't usually bleed into it. Someone chose that location deliberately. Or someone with knowledge of Silk's movements knew he would be there and passed that information along. Either way, by the time Silk arrived at that location, the trap was already set. The shooter was already in position. Everything was already in motion. And Silk, moving with the same calm confidence he always moved with, surrounded by the world he knew, in a place that felt safe because it was familiar, had no idea. The morning of the last day of Silk's life begins like every other morning in Ada Park. The South Side wakes up slowly in winter, when the Chicago cold presses against every window and the sky stays gray until mid-morning. But even in summer, even when the light is good and the air is warm and the neighborhood has the kind of energy that Chicago summers produce, That particular combination of relief and tension that comes from months of cold finally releasing, Ada Park wakes up with weight. With the accumulated weight of everything the neighborhood has been through, everything it carries, everything it knows about itself, Silk moves through his morning the way he always does. He is not a man who moves chaotically. He is not a man who wakes up and reacts to the day. He sets the terms. He decides the pace. He goes where he intends to go and sees who he intends to see, and the people around him organize themselves accordingly. He checks on his people. This is something that people who knew him consistently emphasize, that Silk took care of his circle, that being in his orbit meant being looked after, being checked on, being someone he kept an eye on. This was part of what made people loyal to him, not just fear of consequences, not just the calculation of self-interest, but the genuine sense that this man cared about the people around him and showed it in concrete ways. He handles his business. The specific details of what that means on this particular day we don't know. But the general shape of it we understand. The conversations, the arrangements, the management of all the relationships and obligations that come with holding the kind of position Silk held in Ada Park. This is not a life of leisure. It is a life of constant management, constant vigilance, constant attention to the variables that keep everything in balance. He moves through Ada Park with the deliberate calm that has always defined him. And the people he passes, the people who know him, who know his name, who understand his position, they respond the way they always respond, with deference, with respect, with the particular body language of people who are in the presence of someone whose authority they recognize and whose position they do not challenge. Nothing looks wrong. Nothing feels wrong. This is just another day in Ada Park, and Silk is just moving through it the way he always has. But somewhere, a clock is running, and somewhere, a person who knows his movements better than almost anyone is watching and relaying and waiting. As the day progresses, Silk makes his way toward the location where it will all end. We don't know if he was invited there by the person who betrayed him. We don't know if it was a place he went regularly and his patterns were simply observed and reported. We don't know the exact conversation that got him there, or who else was with him, or what he was thinking as he moved through the last hour of his life. What we know is this: he arrived, and the person waiting for him, positioned at a distance with sight lines that Silk couldn't see, armed with a weapon designed for exactly this kind of distance, that person was ready. The area outside the skating rink, other people around, the normal sounds and rhythms of a neighborhood going about its day. Silk, moving the way he always moved, aware, deliberate, present, and then a shot from a distance, from a position Silk never had a chance to locate, never had a chance to respond to, never had a chance to do anything about. Walter Silk Bennett went down, the man who had survived more than a decade of Chicago's most dangerous street life, the man who had navigated rivals and cases and betrayals and close calls that would have ended lesser men, the man whose very name was a kind of armor, who had built his reputation so carefully, so deliberately, that just the mention of it created space around him. Down, 30 years old, in the neighborhood where he was born, in the city he knew better than anywhere else on earth, surrounded in the end, not just by his world but by the trap that someone he trusted had built inside it. Walter Silk Bennett was gone. In the immediate aftermath, Ada Park absorbs the news the way it absorbs every loss, with grief that is real and profound, and with the particular kind of hardened acceptance that comes from living in a place that has buried too many people to still be shocked by it. Word moves fast in neighborhoods like this. It doesn't need social media. It doesn't need news coverage. It moves through the block the way all significant information moves in close-knit communities, person to person, corner to corner, household to household, until everyone who needs to know knows. And everyone needed to know that Silk was gone. For the people who had been close to him, the men who had worked alongside him, who had been in his circle, who had built their own lives in the shadow of his protection and authority, the loss was seismic. Not just because they had lost a friend or a leader or a source of income and protection, but because Silk had seemed on some level permanent. He had been there for so long, had survived so much, had moved through the world with such consistency and such apparent invulnerability that his death forced a reckoning with something these men had perhaps been avoiding. Nobody is permanent, not even Silk. For his family, the loss was something different and something deeper, because they didn't experience Silk as a street legend. They experienced him as a father, a partner, a man with flaws and complications and absences that had created real pain. And they also experienced him in those final years as someone who had begun to show up, who had found his way back to his son, who had started to build something real with Davon in the 3 years they had together. And now, that was over. Tasha was left to raise her children in the aftermath of a loss that was both personal and public, to explain to an 11-year-old boy why his father was gone, to hold together a family that had already been held together by sheer force of will, to keep going in the way that women in these neighborhoods keep going because they don't have the option of stopping. And Davon, 11 years old enough to understand death but not old enough to fully process it, carried his father with him, in silence at first, in the way that children carry things they don't have words for yet. In the particular heaviness that settles into a child who loses a parent before they've had enough time with them. Over time, that silence became music. Those unspoken things became lyrics. That 11-year-old boy became a rapper who told stories about the streets with a specificity and an emotional honesty that nobody else in Chicago, and few people anywhere, could match. And at the center of all of it, always, was his father. King Von grew up to become one of the most compelling voices that Chicago's South Side has ever produced. His music was vivid and detailed and specific in a way that felt almost documentary, like he was transcribing the world around him in real time, holding nothing back, making you feel the weight of every moment he described. Songs like Crazy Story and Took Her to the O&O Block weren't just rap songs. They were dispatches from a world that most of their listeners would never set foot in, told by someone who had lived every detail of it, and running underneath all of it, always, was his father. You can hear Silk in King Von's music if you know what to listen for. The emphasis on loyalty, the suspicion of people who haven't been tested, the understanding that circles must be small because every person you add is a potential variable you can't fully control, the willingness to love deeply within that circle and to protect it with everything. These are not just street values in the abstract, these are specific values that Silk transmitted to his son in 3 years of actually being present, 3 years of showing Davon what a man who lived by a code actually looked like. Von talked about it directly. He talked about how his father taught him to choose his circle carefully. He talked about loyalty as the thing that mattered above everything else. He talked about his father being the definition of real. And what he meant by real was not just street credibility. He meant authenticity, consistency, being exactly who you say you are in every circumstance, without flinching. He called his father the older version of himself. And looking at the two lives side by side, the parallel is almost unbearable in its precision. Both men born on Chicago's South Side, shaped by the same environment and the same codes. Both men rising to positions of extraordinary power and respect in their respective worlds. Both men defined above everything else by loyalty, by the quality of their circles, by the code they lived by. Both men killed by gun violence. Both men gone too young. Both men leaving behind children who would have to figure out how to carry what they were given. Silk at 30, Von at 26. Father and son, same story, different chapter. When King Von died outside a nightclub in Atlanta on November 6, 2020, he was 26 years old. His son, Davon Jr., was young enough that the memories he's building of his father are the memories that will have to last him a lifetime. Young enough that he will spend the rest of his life learning who his father was from other people, from music, from the stories that get told about him the way stories got told about Silk. The cycle continues, and it is both a tragedy and a testament to the power of the world these men came from, and to the impossibility of escaping it once it has its grip on you. It has been nearly 20 years since Walter Silk Bennett was killed outside that skating rink on Chicago's South Side. 20 years, and here we are, still talking about him, still telling his story, still trying to understand who he was and what his life meant and why it ended the way it did. That kind of staying power, that ability to remain relevant and discussed and remembered 2 decades after your death, is not nothing. In a world that produces tragedies at a relentless pace, where names get lost and stories get buried under the weight of everything that comes after them, the ones that last are the ones that meant something, the ones that were connected to larger truths about the places and the times that produced them. Silk's story lasts because it is connected to King Von's story, yes, but it also lasts because it is a story about something universal dressed up in the very specific clothes of Chicago's South Side. It's a story about the price of power, about the cost of loyalty, about what happens when the thing that protects you, the tight circle, the earned trust, the carefully maintained relationships, has a crack in it that you can't see. It's a story about a man who built something extraordinary in extraordinarily difficult circumstances, and who was taken out not by recklessness, but by the one variable that no amount of discipline can fully protect against: a betrayal from someone you genuinely believed in. And it's a story about love. The love between a father and a son who only got 3 years together but made those 3 years count for something permanent. The love that King Von carried into every room he ever walked into, every song he ever recorded, every lyric where he referenced his father's name and his father's legacy. The love that turned grief into art. The love that made sure Walter Silk Bennett would be remembered. Silk from Ada Park, King Von's father. A man who lived by a code and died because of it. Not because the code was wrong, but because the world he inhabited is one where even the best code, even the tightest circle, even the most careful and disciplined life eventually meets something it cannot overcome. He was the older version of King Von, and King Von was his continuation. And now that continuation lives in the music, in the memories, in the children who carry them both forward into a future neither of them got to see. Rest in peace to Silk from Ada Park. Rest in peace to King Von. Like father, like son, in every way that phrase can be meant, and in every way that it hurts.